With ethical relativism, there's a lot of different strengths. Some of the pros would be it's very determinate. You know how to behave because these rules can be easily discovered. I mean, they're written down. Yes, there are written and unwritten rules of behavior, but usually the unwritten ones, these are more like customs or traditions. You're not going to go to prison for them. For example, in the United States, we have personal space values where people need to be kept at a certain distance. You don't talk right in someone's face. You're told not to stare at something that's strange. You don't point. In our culture, we're taught to like ignore it and act like we don't observe it. Hygiene, bathing, wearing deodorants, brushing your teeth, these sorts of things are norms in our culture, but they're not laws. If you break them, people might ostracize you, but they're not going to throw you in prison or think you're immoral. They may just think you're gross. But you're taught from a very young age. I mean, in kindergarten, you're taught most of the rules and values of our society, how to behave, how to treat others. And so you grow up so it feels very natural to you within your own culture. Where it becomes difficult is if you've been taught to behave one way your whole life and then you visit another culture or someone from another culture comes and visits you. Well, we tend to be ethnocentric. And ethnocentrism is like racism, except instead of judging someone based on the color of their skin, we judge them based on their culture. And it's very normal for us to judge other people based on what we believe are right and wrong behaviors, because that's what we've been taught our whole life. How to eat properly. I mean, eat with your fork, not with your hands. Well, if you were living in many African countries, you're supposed to eat with your hands. And not just with your hands, but with a specific hand. And so all these sorts of things would play in. It's very natural for the culture you're brought up into. It also helps bring uniformity and order to a culture if you have people following the same norms and values. And if you don't like it, if you don't like your culture, if you want to run around half naked, or if you want to eat with your hands, well, there's plenty of places you can move to. And if you can't find a place that suits you, well, you can always move off to your own desert island and set up your own mores and values. Some of the cons of ethical relativism, however, are that there's no universal or moral absolutes. Ethics vary from time and place. Now, there are moral absolutes in each culture, and you need to learn them as you move from different places, but there's no overarching standard by which to judge cultures and say, well, this is a more ethical culture, this is a less ethical culture. All cultures are just kind of put on equal footing, even though one culture may seem very perverse or twisted compared to our ethical values. That other culture could just say, stop being ethnocentric, stop judging us. And so that's one of the positives of ethical relativism, like we talked about. It's its toleration, but the downside is there's no way to evaluate or judge the behavior of other cultures. Not only can't you evaluate or judge the behaviors of other cultures, you can't even evaluate or judge the behaviors of your own culture. If there's something going on in your society or culture, maybe it's slavery, or maybe it's circumcision of females, or maybe it's some sort of prejudice against a certain class or group of people. Well, if that's the way it is in your society, who are you to say that that's wrong behavior? And what are you basing that judgment on? You're certainly not basing it on the norms and values of your society. And in ethical relativism, that is what makes something moral or immoral, what your society says. Now, the only way you can change the values of your society is to have a revolution and overthrow the people who were in charge ahead of you, and then you can make a new set of rules and you can force other people to conform to the new values. And if they don't like it, you can throw them out of the country or impose heavily penalties on them until they conform to this new rule of law or this new ethical code. What this means, though, is you really can't judge other people. You can't even say things like the Holocaust was wrong, because if that was the value of Nazi Germany, then we can't look back from the 21st century America and say, well, that was so evil. How could people be so evil? Well, you're judging them from your standards, not from theirs. Now, if you could make a case that that was immoral to do from 19th century Nazi German perspective, well, then you could talk about the morality or immorality of the Nazis, but it would have to be done within their own ethical framework, not yours. Lastly, it makes international laws or standards impossible. I mean, how do you have international copyright laws if different cultures have different ideas on what can and cannot be considered personal property? In the West, we have a huge tradition of intellectual property belonging to people who came up with ideas. In the East, not so much so. There may be a view of physical property belonging to someone, but not necessarily concepts or ideas. And so if you can't reconcile these things, how are you going to have a universal or worldwide idea of copyrights, what's ethical, what's not, what can be perceived as personal property, and the list goes on and on. So I hope that was helpful for you. Ethical relativism, we all use it to a degree. I often still find myself, even at this stage in my life, wondering sometimes why I do certain things. And if you have children in your life and they ask you the why questions, like, well, why do we have to brush our teeth? Or why do we have to wear clothes? Or why do we have to take a bath? And a lot of times I just tell them it's because in this culture, if you don't do these things, people will think poorly of you, and it's going to create a hard time for you. And other things like not stealing or killing or taking another person's wife or boyfriend or girlfriend, I mean, in our culture, those things are still considered inappropriate or immoral deeds. At least I think they are, the last time I checked. But it leaves out any universal standard for judging your own behavior or people from other times or places. And in that sense, it seems to be found wanting. So there's a breakdown, the difference between ethical relativism, which is prescriptive, it tells you how to behave, when in Rome, do as the Romans. Cultural relativism, which is descriptive, it simply tells you in different times and different places people acted and behaved in different ways. And then moral relativism or personal relativism, also called like situational ethics, it's like there are no absolute standards for morality. Why should we have to wait for society to change, or why should we have to move to another culture? Why can't we just live how we want to live if ethics and morality are arbitrary in the first place? Next up is natural law theory.